Hey everyone, welcome back to the Unfinished Podcast. I'm Sam Elsner, and wow, I just finished recording what might be one of the most mind-bending conversations I've ever had. You know that feeling when someone completely flips your understanding of something you thought you knew? That happened to me about 7 to 10 times minimum in the span of 2 hours with today's guest, Kathy Sierra. Now you might be thinking, Sam, why are you talking to someone who works with horses on a movement and skill development podcast? And honestly, that question is exactly why this conversation is so important. Kathy has lived what feels like 5 different professional lives: exercise physiologist, fitness director, game developer for Virgin and MGM, Java trainer at Sun Microsystems, best-selling author with over 2 million copies sold, and now she's revolutionizing how we think about movement and learning through her work with horses on a farm in the San Juan Islands. But here's the thing, this isn't really about horses. This is about everything we've been taught about practice, repetition, and the correct way to develop skills. It's about the gap between what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing. And it's about why the most advanced robotics researchers are now saying we need to train machines like animals, not like, well, machines. Kathy had a horse named Dreamer, who was essentially given a death sentence by traditional training methods. Instead of accepting that, she threw out everything she'd been taught and basically gamified his training and recovery using principles of self organization and authentic motivation. Not only did she save his life, but she discovered something profound about how we all learn and adapt. We dive deep into why sameness is death when it comes to skill development, why that 5% of your brain that thinks it knows everything might actually be getting in the way, and why the most robust finding in motor learning research suggests that your body has capabilities far beyond what you can consciously direct. This conversation challenged my assumptions about coaching, about learning, about what it means to truly develop mastery. Whether you're an athlete, a coach, a parent trying to help your kids develop skills, or just someone who's ever felt stuck on a plateau, this episode is going to give you a completely different lens to look through. Fair warning though, we get a little nerdy about complexity theory, ecological dynamics, and why traditional biomechanical approaches might be fundamentally flawed. But we also talk about practical stuff like why you should never try to fix someone's golf swing by telling them what to do with their shoulders, and why the best thing you can do for a stuck pattern might be to forbid it entirely for 2 weeks. Oh, we also touch on AI, video games, Dungeons and Dragons, and why the future of robotics is making me even more convinced that we've been thinking about human development all wrong. This is exactly the kind of messy, unfinished conversation that this podcast is all about. We're not here to give you a neat, tidy framework. We're here to explore the edges, question the assumptions, and maybe discover the path forward is a lot more playful and a lot less prescribed than we've been led to believe. So grab a coffee, settle in, prepare to have your brain rattled a little bit. This is the Unfinished Podcast, episode 2 with Kathy Sierra. Let's dive in. Well, Kathy, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to sit down and talk with me today. Um, I know life is probably a little busy in your end, so yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I just listened to your
Yeah, no,
previous episode with um
with
Greg.
Greg Shouters.
Yes.
Yeah, good. What'd you think of that?
Well, I always love listening to him, and I thought it was a good conversation. It had some things, uh, some perspectives that I haven't really heard discussed very often in other conversations that where I've listened to him. So I enjoyed it.
Good, good. I'm glad. I'm with that being my first podcast episode, I guess, back with this whole relaunch. That's what I've been kind of doing, trying to figure my way out in life, figure out my new identity and all that stuff. It's good to hear. I'm glad that
I get it.
it it resonated with people.
It did. I hope you don't mind. I'm still drinking my morning coffee, so I'm waking up here.
Ap- I totally get that. And what it's where are you located again? Are you in
It's it's
California or where?
it's not that early. I'm in the San Juan Islands, which is
Oh, okay.
right at the border of Canada and the US, north of Seattle. So,
Okay. Okay, nice, nice. No worries. I totally get it. There's times where I have coffee later in the morning or even the afternoon if I need a little jump start. So let's kind of jump right into this. So I was doing a little bit of research on your background and your whole journey. And you know what? I just kept thinking that there's your transformation has been so I think uplifting, especially to me, just because like these past couple months, and honestly throughout my life, I've kind of trying to find my way and figure things out because you went from, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but like you went from exercise physiologist, fitness director, game developer for Virgin and MGM, Java trainer at Sun Microsystems, and then best-selling author with 2 million copies sold, and now you're on a farm in San Juan Islands. Like, that's a lot of lives in one lifetime. Um, and that's just fascinating. And what really has like resonated with me is with the I won't say random because
right.
it just happens. Random career changes, but I suspect that there's a deeper pattern here, something that connects all of this together to that leads you to where you are now. And I was looking at a lot of your stuff, and you're working with horses right now, correct?
Yes. Those are my athletes
Tell
now.
me, yeah, yeah, no, I love it. I've been kind of following your work for the last few years, like on social media, but like looking at it. Like, what led you to working with your current athletes now?
Well, the horses were always there. They were like my passion, my hobby, like the way someone might be, really interested in playing guitar or gardening or something that had nothing to do with their work or, so I thought uh for such a long time. But like when you said, the pattern and connecting the dots, I'm a very strong believer in obviously complexity theory, and you can't really connect the dots until you look backwards, right? You can see how,
Mhm.
oh yeah, this, this, I'm connecting this dot over here with this, and I'm bringing in this thing that I learned from that part of my life and this thing, and then they come together. But you can't do that in advance. So you can't plan for that place you're going to end up, but you can put yourself in situations where you allow for serendipity and where you're willing to say, what is it that may be unique to my background over here in this completely unrelated field that actually I can apply, that's a unique perspective, when most people and how most of us were brought up, and I'm a lot older than you, so we were really brought up to be, you're going to be focused on one thing, you're going to have one education, you're going to have one career for the rest of your life, and that's it. And then you can retire and have your hobbies, right? Whatever. But to be able to
Mhm.
say, maybe there are a whole bunch of people over here in this domain, in this field, whatever it is, and they're just not looking at what these folks over here in a completely different science domain have figured out. And of course, part of that is a problem with science in general, that there are silos, and
Hmm.
every aspect of research and the journals, and then people working in professions, and then even in subdivisions. I've talked to biomechanics PhDs who've said there are people so focused on just the biomechanics of one body part that it would never occur to them to really, look at what's happening as an overall system. So, of course, that's a whole other issue that we can talk about. But the
Yeah.
horses were always just my hobby and my passion. And for reasons I'll never understand, maybe it's because they're big, they're quadrupeds, they can be scary in a bunch of different ways. And I just assumed that everything I knew from my original background and education and it was, well, now we would call it kinesiology, but at the
Hmm.
time it was actually called the science of physical education. So it's kind of a new field for education. And but it's the usual stuff, right? So exercise
Yeah.
physiology, which I absolutely loved, biomechanics and anatomy, of course, which I wasn't as thrilled by, and then a lot of what we then called sports psychology, but it was mainly all sorts of stuff on motor learning and that whole world. So I just assumed nothing applies to horses. It's just for humans, and that was a silly thing to think. But at the time, it just seemed like, well, the anatomy is different, the physiology is different, the neurology is different. It turns out that's not true. The similarities are astonishing. I guess they shouldn't be astonishing. We're all mammals. They have the same nervous system architecture that we have for the most part, with very few exceptions. And some of those exceptions are just about the size of relative structures, but everything for pain, they
Hmm.
have all the same mechanoreceptors. Their ligaments and tendons, their bones, even a lot of the anatomy is named exactly the same, even though it looks different. And their
Hmm.
exercise physiology. I finally started studying equine exercise physiology and found out that most of it is just, what we would call comparative. It's saying, look, here's what we know from the vast studies on humans. We've taken some of those studies and uh, tried to replicate them for horses to see if it still applies. And then, boom, if it applies, we start making all sorts of other assumptions that then this whole giant category of things in exercise physiology are probably very similar. I mean, they have a very different respiratory system, but yeah, they're basically just like super athletes. So everything that I had
Yeah.
learned in my background about developing movement uh, turned out to be, why was I ignoring it in the horse world? And I think I was ignoring it because the training in the horse world is so traditional, just in so many ways, like a lot of human training. Only the first book on horsemanship and horse training is 2,000 years old. So it's got a very long history, and it's just, it's sacred, and, you just don't question those things. And I finally waited until one of my horses was in such a dire condition, had lost all desire to move. And, now my mantra is sort of, my whole goal is the horses, I want all horses to love movement again. And this
Hmm.
horse, not only did he hate movement, and he was only, I think at the time, just turning 7 years old, very young. He couldn't move. And if a horse stops moving, they won't live very long.
Hmm.
Even if you could tolerate their quality of life, they can't function if they can't move. So, for so many reasons, and it was really life or death. And I had already had things in the back of my mind that were starting to not make sense to me. That the traditional things that we had said, much like in the human world, where you start thinking, wait a minute, we know the SAID principle, we know that training is very specific and adaptation is very specific. But if we're training with only this very narrow, correct biomechanics, what does that mean for all the stuff that's not being trained? All the movement options that are not
Hmm.
being trained? If there's no adaptation there, that feels like a risk in every possible way. So just a lot of,
Hmm.
those kinds of things where you just have to look, you don't have to look deep. You just have to scratch off the surface and say, the stuff we were doing doesn't really fit what we actually know, what we've even always known. But now, of course, there's a lot more interesting and useful motor learning research, but even the basics. So I finally just started saying, I need to rethink everything about movement. And I'll just cut to the short version is self-organization was the answer. And it had to be 100% self-organization. Well, I mean, my belief is if it's not 100% self-organization, it's not actually self-organization. So to help recover his love of movement, he needed to have authentic reasons to actually want to move and to move in whatever way felt doable for him. And motivation played a role. He had to want to use his body for movement purposes. So it was like trying to sort of reach past whatever else was going on and give him a reason to want to move again, and then be what we never do with traditional horsemanship, 1000% hands off, absolutely no physical corrections, no physical manipulations. And of course, that was pretty tricky because how do you communicate with a horse to move his body without telling
Yeah.
him how to move? And so you can kind of see why the moment I kind of stumbled into the constraints-led approach, it was like, well, now my life just got 1,000 times easier because
Hmm.
now there's a perfect way to do it. Just you manipulate the environment and the tasks. And what shocked me was how much motivation to move came out of that authenticity. And it's now been over 10 years. Uh, I already was very familiar with Eleanor Gibson's work because I was using her work
Hmm.
to teach computer science. It never occurred to me. I did not study her husband's work. I didn't study much on ecological psychology, just enough for perceptual pattern matching and things. But I just never looked at the
Yep.
physical stuff. Or I wasn't really interested in the optical array, so I hadn't looked at that aspect. And then I was Googling, you might have heard me talk about this story, for perceptual learning and Gibson. And I found Rob Gray's podcast. And I was like, oh, fantastic, a whole podcast about this. Look at this. And I just clicked in. It was very early on in his podcast. I clicked in and it was, Sean Mishka. And that was just such a moment. It took me quite a few minutes to realize they were not talking about Eleanor. They were talking about her husband, James. But I was like, they're using this in movement. And it just, like, suddenly all the pieces, that's when the pieces really clicked. And I went, oh, this is my two worlds now fit together, because everything that I'd been learning about perceptual learning and perceptual exposures and pattern matching, now I can just completely apply this to the horses, and they have a whole framework. And then, then learning about differential learning and everything. It was just like, so suddenly it made the work so much easier, and I didn't feel so alone. Like, there are other people doing this. And then,
Hmm.
again, because it was very early on, I had a long conversation on the phone with Sean, and I was realizing that, the people doing it in the human world, they too were experiencing, and sadly, apparently still are, the heavy criticism from the outside, and that you're violating all these long, traditions of, we must teach people the fundamentals. It's not safe for their body if they don't first learn the correct biomechanics, right? On and on and on. All the
Hmm.
same things. And he would have the exact same arguments from people. And then when he would have success with his athletes, people wouldn't believe that he had actually done it that way. Like, we both had that same experience where people think you're secretly, or maybe even you're just too stupid to realize it, doing traditional training somewhere. And then you think that, it's this other stuff that's doing the work. So all these
Hmm.
experience and struggles with using these kinds of tools, he was going through the same thing. But like I said, that was almost 10 years ago. So a lot has progressed since then. Not as much as I
I
would
love
wish,
it.
but
No, I love it. You hit a lot of major topics that, I've kind of come across in the past, I guess coming up on 5 years now since I kind of came across this revelation of, you know, ecological dynamics, J.J. Gibson, Eleanor Gibson, all of this whole umbrella of just everything, honestly. And I grew up, well, I started out as, a strength and conditioning coach, um, having been told how to program right, do this, you have to do everything in phases. And if an athlete, for example, like it before an athlete, when they first come to you, before they get to a barbell, they have to do something this way before that. And I'm just like, that's not how I was raised. And I grew up in middle of nowhere, Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so I never touched a barbell really until I was in high school. And then I right away was in like touching stuff like this. And nonetheless, but I was raised that way from just like it has to be structured. You have to plan out the whole year with programs. And when I was an athlete in college, I was given my weightlifting book from the very beginning of the season, and it had every single week laid out. And I'm just like, really? What would happen if I woke up sick one day? What would happen if I woke up sick one day or if I got injured? I have to go by this program. And that kind of like started me down this path. And I kind of had this innate sense of just like experimenting, learning, being playful and like gamifying stuff, but I never really knew how to. And I had this overarching question of like, how am I able to make this like bridge the gap between like the science, the research, all of that, and make it applicable to performance or just like life change. That's when I came across Tyler Yerby, who is very good friends with Sean Mishka, and I haven't had much like interactions with Sean, but I know of him and I know of Emergence. But Tyler's kind of like a good friend of mine slash my mentor with all this. When I got exposed to this, that's when the light bulb clicked for me. I was just like, it made things so much easier from
yes.
the aspect of I didn't have to program from like I had like a soft layout and then it adjusted based on the day and how to individualize things. And I was like, it when you were talking about these siloed approaches with researchers and like the biomechanics of just the arm and everything, it's when you're standing in front of the tree, if you take a couple steps back, you can actually see the forest.
Yes.
That kind of rang in my head. That was that moment for me. And that it and I'm still learning a lot of these to this day. It's just now I have a little bit more free time on my hands to actually dig into it and all this, and actually have these conversations with people like yourself. So my views, my ideas on it are probably different from Sean's or others, but that's what makes us human and what makes this whole thing beautiful. You actually covered actually one of my next questions about how you went or you had this horse. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I butcher the name, is it Dramer?
Yes, Dramer.
That it's
Actually, I
Dramer,
guess in
Dramer,
Icelandic it's Dramer, but yes, yeah, Dramer.
Dramer. I love it. So, and I during my research of your whole journey, you basically went against all norms of like what experts were saying, like basically writing it off, and was scheduled for like euthanization and all that.
Yep.
You basically
Yep.
gamified recovery and saved his life. Like
Yes.
that's amazing. That is amazing. And one thing
Yes.
that I'm actually working on right now is kind of a framework to teach people this and like get out there. It's called the games framework, gamifying anything to improve skill. Like, and my own case study right now is actually with the guitar. I'm picking it back up and trying to gamify things that way. This resonates so well with me because
Absolutely.
you basically took something that you love, something that you helped to raise, like it's your baby, and you brought it back to life. Tell me about that. I want to go more into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I want to make it clear that a lot of the, well, I would probably say all of the problems that he had were that became life and death. Like a lot of horses would never get that dire. Were ultimately caused by me, doing traditional training. Um, and there are, I mean, I've encountered a whole bunch of people who have very, very similar, shockingly sad, tragic stories, sometimes without a happy ending, about horses that
Mhm.
have become so damaged by traditional training, which, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in equestrian sport that's really harmful for the horses because they're basically treated like sporting equipment, not like living,
Yeah.
feeling beings. But most of it is by people who are very well intended, but there is such a strong, overwhelming belief that they have to do correct biomechanics and that their body will never choose to do anything good. And so we have to train them from scratch, from the bottom up. We have to retrain all their movements, and they must be therefore micro-shaped. So we end up putting equipment. How do you get 1,000-pound animal to move exactly the angles and ways that you want? You have to do it with some form of force. Then, since you're a strength and conditioning coach, you'll understand this. The question is, why didn't people with a background in exercise physiology like me, why did we shut that part of our brain off?
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
you put equipment on the horse, and let's say you want the horse to bend his neck a certain way. So you just pull, you gently or not, until the horse finally decides to let go and figures out how to organize around that. Well, now we're just training him to resist the very thing, right? It's a perfect resistance exercise for the thing we don't want. And that's
hmm
what most horse training is still based on, because the assumption is the horse is never going to want to do these movements. So, what's good for his body or the high level sport movements? So, we need to make them do it one way or the other. And the continuum is just about basically how mean you are when you're doing it. But you start with the assumption that the horse will be made to do it. You put metal in their mouth so that you can better direct exactly how they move. Part of it is just to have control, which again is a whole nother problem that turns out to be ridiculous. But I can understand it. It's
hmm
scary, right? But most of it is to try to shape the horse's movements, the literal opposite of self-organization. I already had a background in self-determination theory, so intrinsic motivation. And that's really what I was using when I made the decision about Dramer. I was coming down to the wire of having to make the decision of having him euthanized. His quality of life was terrible, and he had been diagnosed with a neurological disease because that's the closest thing they could come up with. And then later studies showed that it turned out he didn't have that disease. So now we're like, well, what the hell's wrong with him? Had all the x-rays. They figured
Wow.
he was a horse that looked like he'd broken his neck in several places. I mean, it was just so horrible. And, but he still had a little spark. There was still something in there. And I literally had the dark night of the soul I was reading the book Drive by Dan Pink, which is it's a great book, and he has a TED Talk that explains it all, but it's really just self-determination theory of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, but in a nice little, accessible for like business. And at the same time, I was reading again that 2,000-year-old book on horsemanship by Xenophon. So at the same time, I'm reading this stuff about intrinsic motivation. Near the end of Dan Pink's book, he said, horses or humans are not like horses. simply responding to the carrots or sticks. And I sort of rolled my eyes and I thought, well, yeah, turns out horses aren't like horses either, right? And then, that kind of had this moment of thinking, well, wait a minute. That's not true for horses either, because every possible carrot and stick had been tried with this horse. Maybe this whole thing about intrinsic motivation would apply to horses too. What would that mean? And at the same time, I'm reading this other 2,000-year-old book where Xenophon, he wanted his horses to inspire other horses of the troops, right? These were warriors. And it's like, I'm the leader. I need my horse to be so, I'm going to misuse the terms, to be so badass and prancing and like fiery. I'm awesome, right? I'm such a incredible mover. I want my horse to show off and get the other horses to feel awesome. And so I looked at that and I thought, wow, okay, how do you do that? And in his book, he said, this 2,000-year-old book, he said, basically give your biggest reward when the horse is actually showing off for other horses. And it just hit me. It's like, there's nothing I can give him that will either be forceful enough, painful enough, he's way checked out from that, or, enough food rewards or, nothing. He wants to, and I'm like, okay, so in self-determination theory, part of it is mastery, right? Autonomy and mastery are two core elements. So it's like, well, I can give him autonomy, just freedom, right? I'm not going to make him do anything. But what would a horse want to master? And then I'm like, oh God, well, he wants to master being more of a horse. Just like I think humans want to master being, whether they know it or not, being more human, right? More of who and what we are, the movements we're capable of executing, the tasks we're capable of doing, the environments we're capable of being badass in. So if I take that as the core assumption, he just wants to be more, masterful at being a horse, not being someone else's riding horse or just being a horse. So I thought, what would that look like? What would cause him to start to want to feel like a proud horse? And at the time I did something that was extremely risky that I would never actually suggest to anyone. But again, this was life and death. So I knew that if I really kind of made him so annoyed, like you couldn't, if you tried to touch him with a whip or hurt him in any way, that would just cause him to completely shut down. In the earlier days, he would like try to kill you, but then he got to where there was just no lights were on. He didn't care. He looks like he didn't feel anything, but you could still annoy him in the right situation. So if I like snapped a whip behind him on the ground, he would get just enough annoyed that he would start to poof his body up a little bit, like that sort of natural reaction of, ugh. And it was him giving me what I would call at the time dissing me, right? Dissing the human, like disrespecting, which of course horses are never supposed to do, right? Well, I then rewarded him for that. And he knew the cues, he knew the words for, yes, that's an awesome thing that you just did. So first of all, it kind of blew his mind because I basically overnight started rewarding him for getting pissed off at me, as long as it wasn't going to kill me, right? For like the postures, the movements through his butt, like getting his body to poof up a little bit and be like, and any shred of it, the tiniest hint. And then he responded to that so fast that he started trying to put his body into these shapes. And it was like, if you didn't know horses, it would probably be almost impossible to see the difference that it was happening. But if you knew horses and knew him, you could see that he was doing it. When everyone can recognize a big stallion, wild stallion out in the field, prancing around and showing off and making themselves like big and awesome. But he was on his way. And I think like maybe 2 days later, my husband was like, I just saw Dramer standing next to one of the horses and trying to poof himself up. And it was like, he's trying to practice this and he's trying to show the other horses, right? And that very quickly then turned into, okay, but Now can you move with like this power and proudness? And, exercise physiology wise, it took many, many months, right, for him to recover even the ability to, I mean, those tissues had to develop, but the desire was there. You could see the neural pathways were happening, and it was all authentic. And so from that moment on, that was just a straight trajectory up. Like, it was so fast how that turned him around. And, now I can look back and go, all right, he needed authentic reasons to use his body. Only in this case, it was to use his body for only one thing, which was just show me that he was not happy, and try to look scary, even though he wasn't yet capable. And then 100% self-organization. So at that moment, and this was maybe 15 years ago, that's when I like committed, okay, this is it. Like, I'm never, ever going to put anything in their mouth that's going to use, any pain. I'm never going to correct them into movements, never going to not give them a choice. They can always say no. They can just, they don't have to do it. It should be 100% authentic. The movements have to be authentic. The movements have to be self-organized 100%. And I had no idea how I was going to do that, because again, that's where I developed a lot of stuff, but the framework of CLA and differential learning made that, especially CLA, just made that 1,000 times easier, because it's like, oh my God, it's so easy. You just task an environment. It's like, I know what questions to ask, no matter what the problem is. But it was so shocking how well it worked. And then maybe 10 years ago, I had other horses too that I was doing it with. And then other people would come when they had like rehab horses, and they'd heard about it, even though I wasn't and still am not a professional trainer. But then a lot of people knew, and people who had known Dreamer, and they were like, this is so shocking. What happened? Most people just didn't believe it, that's how it happened, right? And then I started showing it to other people, and then I decided, all right, maybe there are other people who have horses that they're that desperate. They have no other options. So I started kind of showing it to other people. At the time I was on Facebook, right? And I always thought it would be like, there might be 10 or 20 people in the world who are so desperate that they have no other options, because why would you do this? Why would you do 100% self-organization? Or even why would you do EcoD, right? This is kind of my little way of framing it. If you didn't really have to. And I was so shocked at how many people, hundreds, now thousands of people, were like, oh no, I didn't have to do this. My horse is fine. This just resonated for me. This is how I want to be with horses. This is how I want my horse athletes to feel. Then people would start, of course, doing it with their own body. And so it kind of became a thing, like, if you search hashtag affordances, you're probably going to find more horses than you, like, people started using the terminology and, studying this stuff, and, but not because they had to. And that's why I was always really impressed with Sean Mishka, because, he tells his Robert Frost story of when he made the switch, because he was already successful. He had very successful athletes. He made this massive shift, which, this can be a painful shift in terms of, how your peers feel about it, right? How everyone feel, how your athletes feel. If you're working with youth athletes, how their parents feel, right? It's such a crazy thing to do, or it seems so. He did it with these top athletes, not because he had to, but because he knew inside they were being successful because of who they were, not because of his drills, not because of how successful they were in his drills. And then he would see that the people who he made really successful in the drills didn't necessarily show up on, game day. So he did it because he knew there was something fundamentally broken about the traditional ways that we were training, and he made the switch. And I'm always super impressed with people who make the switch when they're already successful, because I made it because I was absolutely desperate.
Yeah, no, I love that. And yeah, no, and from knowing Sean and like his Robert Frost moment, yeah, where like making that switch from where he is this successful to, you know, becoming and tinkering with that, the ideas and, just making a switch against this tidal wave of what tradition and how we're raised and whatnot. Even in general, like how we are raised as children, from my perspective, like we're told how to do things like write our ABCs cursive. I remember actually this popped up and this was kind of I'm like with all this is I don't know it I think I had this I faintly remember, but when I was learning how to write on a piece of paper, like my ABCs, it was actually indented on the paper, and I had to follow along and be within the lines on a piece of paper. And that was uniform across my classmates at the time. And now looking at it, it's like, oh, that's just normal. That's what we're supposed to be taught, and all that, and like very structured. Like I'm the reason why I bring this up is I never was the best student in school, like high school, college, and like I hated reading, I hated school just because it wasn't fun. But looking back at it now, like and alluding to kind of like what you've done throughout your whole career and why this podcast is called the Unfinished Podcast is because it's
Love it.
messy and learning and wanting to experiment and be in that middle ground instead of it being black and white. You're in that gray area. I'm ranting a little bit, but um, going back to like how we're taught how to do things and like be robots, basically. Even now, looking
Yeah.
at like my very limited knowledge of equestrian sports, and I've been to the racetrack maybe once or twice in my life. I live like 10 minutes away from Canterbury Park here in Minnesota, and that's like racetrack. And then I watched like the Kentucky Derby once or whatnot, and they're trained like how athletes are today and how we're taught in this educational system, like robots. You can't deviate from it. You can't color outside the lines. And what you did, even though it was kind of like a life or death situation, like you said, screw it. Like now going to that, how do you tell someone that who is on the fence of trying these things because they're being told how to do things from traditional norms to exploring this new realm of thinking with EcoD and this whole umbrella? How do you tell somebody to basically stick the middle finger up to the other how things are being done like from these experts and like all these silos?
Uh, I I can discuss this, but I will say I wish that we all had a better answer. But I think part of the difficulty is that we don't want people to see this as just another technique, right? Or another method, right? This is such a profound shift in, I hate to use the P word, but it's a paradigm shift. It's a giant perspective shift in how you see like the entire world. I mean, it's so
Hmm.
different when you move from linearity to nonlinearity, right? From a complicated machine to complex dynamical systems. The rules literally in the physical world, right? The rules of how things behave when you're dealing with complexity and nonlinearity, right? And butterfly effects and all.
Hmm.
And once you get into that realm, it's as if you're saying gravity doesn't work here, right? It's so different.
Hmm.
And if you try to map some of these techniques, but you haven't changed your fundamental view of what is it we're actually trying to do. So I think helping people understand what problems are we really trying to solve. And then, I used to say, look, do it or don't do it, like go all in or not, right? But otherwise, and we would act like, oh, it's just easy. And I'm no longer, I think, because I've been doing this a long time, a really great person to help absolute beginners make that transition. I mean, I can if they're willing to just kind of go with it and take the leap, but I don't even know how to see in that. Like I can look back and go, how did we ever think any of that made sense? How did we
Mm-hmm.
ever treat bodies like they were, complicated machines? And I have just enough of a background to understand this idea of, like in math, like combinatorial explosion, right? That there's no possible way that you could ever figure out all the compute power on Earth till the end of the, heat death of the universe. We couldn't calculate what is the optimal movement for anything because it's too
Mm-hmm.
complex. But we pretended that we could. We so oversimplified so that it would feel, and I understand the need to feel like you can grasp it and control it. And if you just practice, right? So then we were also raised in this idea of everything is about repetition, right? Repetition is the mother of skill. And if you just repeat, and you get the motor learning pathways. And so all of the
Mm-hmm.
things that we learned about how to get good at something involved just somehow find a way to get yourself into the correct position, already broken assumption one, and then repeat, and then eventually you will own it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both of those are so profoundly wrong that I'm kind of surprised anyone ever got good at anything. And I studied that world as well, the world, but through computer science, weirdly, and artificial intelligence, the idea that people think that what they did to get somewhere, or to achieve a certain skill or capability, is not at all what they actually did. That,
Mm-hmm.
even cognitive scientists will say, look, 5% of what our brain is doing at any given time, we are conscious of, and the rest is the 95%. So I call it like, it's the same percentage as dark matter and energy versus ordinary matter, right? We don't know what it is, but we know it's happening because of
Mm-hmm.
its effects, right? And so it's
Yep.
like this 5%, we're trying to do everything through this 5%, and we're just ignoring the 95% that's been evolving for a very, very, very long time to do what
Yep.
should feel like a superpower to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody knows how they actually learned to ride a bike. And very few people
Mm-hmm.
even know how they ride a bike, but they do it, right? So it's like we all have
Mm-hmm.
experiences. I also happen to be, so I did two sports in high school and college, track and field, running like the 100-meter hurdles and stuff. And I wasn't that great, but they needed another person on the team to do hurdles. So I
Yeah.
was that person. But I was also a sponsored skateboarder. So it was insane. Like no one would ever, and it was just a big team. Santa Cruz had a coach and everything, but no one would try to tell you how to do these moves, right? It would be absurd. No one would tell you biomechanically how you should execute these moves. But yet,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of complexity, but we do it through exposures and, what turns out to be a lot of really good things we would think of now in sort of CLA and differential learning, although sometimes it hurts to get there. But it just wouldn't
Yeah.
occur to anyone. And I even had a job once teaching skateboarding, and I'm like, I have no idea. This is after college. It's like, I had at least 2 years of classes on teaching sport, and I'm like, but this idea of, how do we do it? So I think there are categories of people. There are people who are just ready to take the leap, and they don't, you don't have to understand the science to do this, but you have to be willing to kind of take the leap of faith of what complexity actually means and nonlinearity. And some people, that's why I think it's really different. Some people need just a metric ton of research to feel confident, which is why now we can point to Rob Gray's pages where he's gathering every single day, right? The mounting body of work in every area that crosses, whether it's rehab, right? The variability and injury risk, Yeah, you can teach people how to maybe reduce their injury risk through biomechanics of ACL, whether it's knee valgus or something, or you can just give them lots and lots and lots of good exposures to all these problems to solve. Then you look back and you go, turns out that reduced their injury risk far more than the people who were trained to reduce their injury risk, right? This just stuff just keeps happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
now I can say, look, if you feel more confident that, yes, this is scary, but look at all the evidence. That's something that a lot of people, I think, now feel better about. There's like when I look at Gabby Wolf's work, right? External focus of attention versus internal focus of attention. I can look at that and say, okay, we still know this is the most, robust finding in all of motor learning research in the last 40 years. It's a very, very, very strong. It's been studied a gazillion times. Yeah, there's holes in it in certain areas, right? But we don't have anything that even comes close to being that solid. And, no matter how different perspectives will try to explain that phenomenon, to me, that's the most beautiful example of, or I should say the most beautiful proof of self-organization. It's like, it shouldn't make any difference if somebody says, lift your arm as high as you can versus grab that thing up there. Biomechanically, it should not give you better performance, and yet it reliably does, and sometimes dramatically. There is only, as far as I'm concerned, one explanation, which is self-organization. The body decided it had a purpose for doing the movement. And so it drew on all sorts of things in the system that lift your arm up there. You're focused on, okay, I'm doing it. That's as far as I can go, right? So if I have people in person, I can often do an example that it doesn't work with everyone, but that will almost always give them kind of a shocking moment of the power of like external focus, which then I can make the next step to movement needs an authentic movement purpose. So if I just say, move your arm back there until it feels really tight, and you go, ooh, yeah, okay, yeah, right there, I feel it. But imagine your movement system is saying, but why? Why should I move my arm there? There's no natural, authentic move, right? It had nothing to do with consciously, but just imagine, right? The 95% of our body is like, the frick is the point, right? But if I say, oh, by the way, can you grab that thing over there? Right. And then I can prove to people, you just went this much further and you didn't feel any different. You got tight here, but when I said, oh, can you reach that? And suddenly, where did all that extra capability come from? Well, it came from purpose. Like people always tell the story about, the grandmother that lifts the car off the child, right? And it's like, well, adrenaline. But we know that it's a lot more than adrenaline, right? Activating the sympathetic nervous system, go. But it's also this idea of the movement system needs a reason. If you just go over and say, lift that heavy thing, versus lift that heavy thing because you absolutely have to save something's life, your child's life or whatever. And we can do it with very simple things. That's what I think the external focus of attention shows, that the body has capabilities that are so far outside of our ability to teach, coach, or to even biomechanically understand, even with all the equipment that we have. But the body can figure it out. The body can go, oh, I got this. So in some ways, that's kind of how we think of it, is like, we want to increase the body's ability to say, I got this. And that we don't have to go through the prefrontal cortex, right? You don't have to think your way to it. Your body just has to go, it has to do it. And if you're in a sport that does, that you can't have all this time, right? That you don't get your 600 milliseconds or whatever to plan your exact movement, right? It just has to happen automatically.
Yeah.
Well, then the body the body needs to have that. It doesn't matter what you say in your head or what your coach says or what anyone tells you to do. So I think over the last few years, and my husband is a golf coach now too, so it's pretty funny because golfing is maybe even more biomechanically correct focused than even equestrian sports. It's like, it's insane.
Yeah,
But
for
but
sure.
we have this
I
idea of,
started.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Nope, you go.
so we have this idea that it's really just about owning the movement. But I realized when I say that, that's exactly how people doing traditional training talk about. You do enough repetitions and then one day you will own it. So now we're like, no, your body has to own it from the very beginning. And that's what all of the research supports with things like, like reinvestment theory, even things that are not necessarily ecological dynamics. But the results still show that, if you think about what you're doing, and I think almost everyone intuitively and has experienced that, if you think about what you're doing, your movement starts to deteriorate, right? Your ability, your performance deteriorates. So we know this, but there are all these competing explanations for why. But there's some interesting stuff in the research where if you learned it very traditionally, and first you do this, and then you very mechanically, and you build your way up, and then you rehearse, and now you own it, but it's not very adjustable. So now you have to learn to do it in this situation, and then in this situation, and then this way and that way. That movement is so fragile, even if it's very high performant, if everything is going perfectly, because you never really did own it. So the moment something changes, people who are under stress, whether it's the psychological stress and pressure of a competition or the environment is so different or whatever, will tend to fall back to a more beginnery version of their movement, right? They'll fall back in a pretty predictable way they'll just look less advanced. They'll look more like they looked earlier, depending on how far they fall. But if you never went through those phases, there's nothing to fall back to. There's nothing. You just own it. You own the adaptability from day one. There's nowhere to go, right? There's no beginnery version. There were versions that were less, coordinated when you were figuring it out. But if you didn't build it up in this way, if you did it through exposure with, higher and higher things or, bigger things, and then you're kind of building up exercise physiology, not so much, and the skill is just emerging authentically, then the skill is the skill. There's nowhere to go. I mean, you might lose your physical output on a day if you're not feeling well or, didn't have enough caffeine, whatever. But you won't fall back to a poor skill that you learned earlier and practiced a lot, right? So traditional training, you spend so much time practicing things that are not actually the thing. And if you use a self-organization view, you never really do that. You can practice things that are maybe easier, but you're always practicing the thing, right? There's representative design, and it might be really crappy, but so we have this idea of it's the body that has to buy in, not the brain, and that if the body doesn't buy in, you get the things that unless you're coaching only elite athletes, that most people experience, which is that people can only do it if they're cued, and the moment they're not cued and reminded, or if it's not top of mind, I've got to move my body this particular way, they fall back to an earlier attractor, right? So that's one part. People who get stuck on a plateau and they can't break out of that plateau at a very early stage, typically the intermediate blues, and they just can't seem to get past that. Yet we can look at their physical capabilities and say they're capable of doing a lot more. So why aren't they, right? And those things in particular that they have to be reminded, or they get stuck on a plateau, or that we look at their body and say, it's just clear that they can do more. They have the physical capacities, the action capabilities or
Hmm.
the effectivities in ECOD language, but they're somehow not doing it. We can look at all of those things and say, well, their body hasn't bought in. So their brain has, they can say, oh, well, I know this is the correct way to do. I know I'm supposed to put that shoulder back. Oh, put that shoulder back. Oh, I keep forgetting, put that shoulder back. Well, it makes no sense to keep yelling, put their shoulder back, put their shoulder back. Either themselves telling themselves or the coach, because their body is saying, no, no, that's not the right thing to do.
Hmm.
So the problem we're solving is how to get their body to say, this is the right thing to do. And for me, that's the essence of coaching, because if we can look at that, then we have to look at two things. One, if I say, well, I need their body to decide that's the right thing to do, not because I told them, not because they're being reminded, right? Their body has to decide that's the right thing to do. First, I have to step back and say, am I absolutely sure that that matters? Right? First of all, is that even a thing that matters? And it might be, right? I mean, sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, right? There's a lot of stuff in sports training technique literature where it's based on, it's based on averages. It might have, so with golf, I'll always ask my husband, like, okay, do you know any really good golfers who don't do that or who do it this other totally different way? And he'll be like, yeah. And I'll be like, are they just freakish outliers, or is there a decent group of people who are quite capable? It's not a biomechanics rate limiter. It's just not typical. And so, we'll have that debate. But it's like, okay, then
Yeah.
if you're trying to solve the problem of how do you get their body to buy in, then it's just pointless. You can tell them. So we have this thing we call 2 weeks or 20 years. Like if someone has a really stable pattern they're stuck in, and they just keep falling back to it, even though they're trying, right? They want to do it differently, but then they just keep falling back. Is if we can find just 2 weeks, sometimes more, to stop that stable attractor from happening, like to literally change the landscape and the task 100%, and say to them, you're allowed to do anything but that. And then we will physically do interventions in different ways so that it just doesn't come up, right? We change the affordances in some way. But for 2 weeks, nothing will happen where your body will choose to do the thing that you just keep going to and see what emerges. But people will do it for a lesson, right? And then they'll come back and then they'll do their normal thing that we're trying to change. And then they'll come back and do a lesson, and and 20 years later, they're still struggling. And it's like, no,
It's
we
like
need to
taste
break that
testing a little
pattern.
bit.
And so it's
Yeah,
like,
it's like taste
I
testing.
think a lot of
Yeah.
people don't have that faith that even something that you've been struggling with for 20 years, and a lot of people have students that in some, in equestrian, people have been riding for a very long time, right? Same problems forever. Or like my husband has golf, people have been golfing for a long time and still have the same, issue. And it'll be like, okay, we're going to take 2 weeks. And if they fall back to their pattern because they decided to go out and have fun one day, then you have to restart the timer, because it's like you have to give them their body enough time to explore. It won't have done a lot of tissue development, but usually 2, maybe 3 weeks is enough time for some pathways to open and for their body to start finding all these different ways. And like, you're familiar with differential learning. If we assume, which I absolutely believe, that the body learns from all these sorts of triangulations and recalibrations from all these explorations, right? It connects the dots, but it has to be given enough dots. And that it sometimes is the bizarre outlier dots that cause the body to go, oh, because I did this really freakish, weird thing that no one will ever do, now that led me to being able to do this thing that's actually incredibly useful. And they will, like, yes, people go, well, they're never going to stumble on the right way. And it's like, yeah, they absolutely will if we provide this special environment where that's far more likely to happen. And we have to stop them temporarily from the one thing. So that's kind of one of the ways we differentiate ourselves in training, is that while classical training is you must do it this one way, we're like, you must do it any way but the way that you're doing it. And that's the only way we'll get to things where the body, if the body doesn't agree with you, you're going to fight for the rest of your life. And that person's going to fight with themselves for the rest of their life. So it's like, we could just accept that and say, how do we get the body to agree this is the right thing to do? So like when my husband's doing, has like, he'll come home with some golf problem that someone's having. And I know like this much about golf. So I'll just ask the questions like, well, is there some exercise you could give them, some activity for which their go-to solution, this sort of bad habit or thing you don't want them to do, just stops being useful. Like it just won't work in this situation, whether it's when it's that they have to putt at this much longer distance, or they have to do this, or whatever it is. Find those scenarios where their normal thing they want to do breaks down, because then their body will finally have a damn good reason to search for something else. And yeah, they might hit on a solution that's also not that useful, but that, not so useful, different solution opens the door. So it's sort of like we seek for novelty and difference rather than always seeking incrementally better. Like we just don't do that at all. So it's pretty crazy. So I didn't answer your question. I don't know how to help people make that switch other than I think as people have more exposure to more examples of different people doing it in different ways, so they don't feel like, oh, I'm doing that person's, method. And it starts to become more normalized. I mean, I'm seeing a huge movement not to say movement, but I'm seeing a huge shift in the human movement world, not in the horse world, but like just the time I've been on Instagram, physical therapists and personal trainers who used to do all those, the green check mark. This is the correct form for your squat. Don't do this. That's really shifted. There aren't nearly as many of the big accounts doing that. They will often say now, these are just alternatives. And I think that's huge. They're far less the rules of correctness. So I do think things are starting to change. But then when it comes to skill and technique for sport-specific things, it's going to take a little bit more time. Because of survivorship bias.
There's a little bit. Yep. There's that. There's egos involved. There's a lot of different things that play into that. But when you were, before, you came back to answering my question, my brain literally just exploded quite a few times during that whole thing. Basically, you're saying that even though we are one entity, our brain and body are connected, but you're saying that they're separate. Is that correct?
Well, no, they're not
in
separate.
Some way.
They're not separate. It's that this conscious part, that because the brain is heavily, right, we can't separate any part of the body. But consciousness, the part where we can say, I'm going to control my movement. I'm going to move this way. I'm going to move my arm that way. I'm going to do this thing, right? That part is the part we keep trying to teach to and coach to and talk to, and also ourselves, right? If we're like trying to like, keep my left foot down, keep my left foot down, keep my left foot down. Damn it. Oh, I moved my left foot, right? That is the smallest part of what we are. So if we look at this as one complex system, I want to give control to the 95%, not keep trying to fight with the 5%. The 5% that is the thing that is the new kid on the block in terms of evolution, right? But it thinks it's everything. So I mean, this is just my little visualization for that. The 5% that thinks it's brilliant and knows everything and can talk and can articulate, it's like the baby, right? And we have to just like give it something to do, like put it in the corner and, you know, give it an iPad or something to keep it happy, so that the grown-ups, right, the part that's been, you know, evolving for 500 million years, that really understands movement and can do the most extraordinary superpowery things that, again, no roboticists and engineers and computer scientists can do, just to allow that to do its job. But instead, it's like the little toddler prefrontal cortex that can talk and thinks it knows everything keeps getting in the way. So are you familiar with Tim Galway, who wrote The Inner Game of Tennis?
Yes, yes.
So there's
I
a
think my dad gave me that book when I was younger, and he's like, "Read this. You have to read this." I just defied him and never read it, but I've heard of it, and I think I have to go back and actually read it and
he
all
he
that. But yes.
intuitively long ago, right, figured this out. And I'll have to remember, I'll send you a YouTube link to a video that's just absolutely astonishing. But so he figured this out a long time ago, that there's a part, like he would say, we need to get this talking part of the brain out of the way so the body can do what it does so beautifully. And so his idea was, we just, you know, but again, now there's lots of good academic research, right, which he didn't have at the time, for
Hmm.
why this matters, right? So we need to give it something to focus on, and that won't cause trouble. And so he would joke that this was his comment: if you want to really mess up your opponent in tennis, you just walk up to them and you go, "Wow, your backhand is so much better. What are you doing? What exactly are you doing? How did you improve that?" Right? He's like, just say that.
See,
Just get them thinking about what they're doing, right? But everything was like
that is funny. I
giving
love it.
people other things to focus on so that their brain couldn't, which, you know, our attention is so limited, right? That it is pretty easy to do, right? Like my husband, he'll be
Hmm.
like, okay, just have them count backwards, have them hum something, sing a song, right? Do any, like, you can give people anything, and that stops them from being able to start correcting themselves. So this idea of, you know, something to get out of the way of, you know, the brain, and the part of the brain, the 5% that thinks it knows everything. But unfortunately, this is also the part that thinks it knows how it learned and how other people should learn. So this was something that's been studied a lot in expertise, and this is something that we learned way back when studying artificial intelligence, is that if you uh, ask people an expert, how they do something, they often can explain it perfectly, and they will be completely wrong. It's not at all what they actually do, but they 100% believe this is how I do what I do. So if you say, how do you do what you do? Well, I do this, and then I do this, and then I look at that, and it starts to, of course, explode into complexity, but they still think they know their process. And then with like deep analysis, it'll turn out they're doing a ton of things they don't know they're doing, and they're actually not doing half the stuff they told you that they do. So it's like there's this gap. So the part of, and this is what I think really sort of emerges from Eleanor Gibson's work on perceptual learning, that we have this declarative learning where we can say, okay, I learned this, and now I'm going to do this. And the perceptual learning, which fits in this category of all the unconscious learning, this is stuff we don't even know we're learning. We don't know we're doing it. But our teaching has become so driven by telling people that we're teaching to this part of the brain that is the most fragile and the least helpful. So telling people how to move, and we know, right? We know how poorly that does, but because of survivorship bias, Like someone will go, well, this traditional set of drills was good enough for, and they'll name some top athlete. And I'll be, okay, that's one.
Yeah.
What about the 10,000 who've absolutely failed? Like, that's not a very good
Hmm.
statistic, right? If you have 1 in 10,000 of the planes you build stays in the air, that's not a very good model. But we kind of believe it is.
Mm-mm.
So, or people will go, well, this is how I
Yeah.
learned. And it's like, you might have learned in spite of doing that, not because of it.
Yes. No, that's again like very mind blowing to think about that and that perspective shift from like, you know, the toddler make it distracted. And that's like kind of psychological warfare too. Just like uh I wish I learned this when I was an athlete in track and field. I was a discus thrower, and I had a pretty profound collegiate career, and had those aspirations to go to the Olympics or whatnot. And I came close, but what people kept telling me, I was a technician, and I could teach the technique to a lot of people and like the way I was doing it or my thought process behind it. But that's all I did was I was thinking about making sure my foot's turned this way. And the discus has to be turned this way to get the right trajectory to go the furthest. All that being kind of like um, in modern day, I'm more into golf now. These past few years, like Bryson DeChambeau, he's known as the scientist of golf. He can
Oh,
face
right, right,
angle, measures everything to the T. But then looking like that's kind of how I was when I was an athlete. I had to measure everything. Then when it came towards game like meet day, like it I did well enough that I could do it, but I was always letting my brain take control of the technique versus my body doing the actual event and playing and throwing,
right,
which I think there's one profound time that happened that I was just like I felt that flow state where my mind was somewhere else, but my body did its thing, and that was in practice. It wasn't during meet day. It was there, and
right.
there's also other factors. So I wish, like looking back, and I wish I could have done it, like thought that way. Now looking at golf, now that is kind of like my main, like getting into it. Like I haven't had a coach or teacher or anything of that sort to really teach me. I'm just doing it myself because one, I think it's fun, and I think that's one thing that psychologically too, like I think we need to do more in a lot of
Yep,
coaching, physical therapy
yep,
is like make it fun and gamify it that way. That's why the constraints-led approach is so like awesome. It's
yep.
there's no right or wrong way to do it. I guess gamify it, have fun that way. But now that's just our system is like we have to be so structured. We got to do it this way, and
Golf is
it removes that.
so interesting and a hard problem to
Yeah.
solve. I mean, first of all, it's so many different
Yes.
skills. And I
Yeah.
mean, I think it's fascinating because there are hard mechanical facts, right? So, I mean,
Hmm.
the club face making contact with the ball. That's a thing, right? That's a thing that needs to happen in a particular
Yes.
way. It's the
Yes.
everything else about how to make that happen. And you know, what are you focusing on? So just, I don't know if you're familiar with Adam Young, but Adam Young is about as
Yes.
close, I think, as you can get to. He doesn't quite say eco D or anything, but man, he just gets closer and closer and closer. And so his stuff is really fun. But like, there's also a
Hmm.
lot of really perceptual learning, interesting stuff. So if I kind of do a tiny golf tangent, even though I don't golf, like putting.
Absolutely.
Uh, so we saw some studies that showed that most people, if they're not beginners, right, and they have trouble with putting, it turns out the problem is not that they don't connect with the ball in the way that they want to and hit the way they want, that the ball does exactly what they wanted it to do, but that their problem is they didn't read the green. So
Hmm.
you wouldn't know that without having research, right? Or even with any given individual, right? So a coach can look and say, what did you intend to do? And then the coach can say, actually, you did that, but it just turned out that wasn't the right thing that you should have wanted to do. But your execution was what you wanted. If the problem is your green reading. So whenever I hear stuff like that, that's like perceptual learning 101. That's like catnip to me, because I'm like, oh, that's solvable. Because you could have a workshop with people, and in one day or a weekend, you can't necessarily take all their physical skills up, but you could take their green reading like into the stratosphere. It's sort of like, they need to be a sommelier of the green, and they just don't have the perception. They're not seeing it enough with enough frequency. So I'm very familiar with the perceptual learning research. So I can look at that and go, oh, we could solve this. So like my husband made this game for people where he's got this little tube. I think it's based on kind of the idea of what you use to measure the speed of a green. And he'll hold this thing up, and then he'll hold it at different angles. So people learn how steep it is and how fast the ball, will roll. And then he'll have people start answering, okay, where do you think the ball is going to go? Or what height? It's marked in numbers. He'll go, what angle do you think is needed based on this green to hit that hole? And so they're not even connecting to actually having to golf. They start paying attention to seeing more and more finer detail in the green itself. Like the information we know is there, right? It's going to be harder on some days when the light is really flat, right? I used to be a skier, so it's like, there's sometimes the light's going to make it a little hard. And every time you go somewhere, it's going to be different. But like, they could easily take their expertise in 1 or 2 days. Almost any human with visual capabilities could become like a master green reader in a really short period of time, far faster than you can actually work on all your coordination, and strength and things that require no tissue development whatsoever, right? I mean, neuroplasticity, that adaptation can happen really fast. We don't have to wait for tissues. And then because we've already shown the person's capable of executing, they just weren't reading. So it's finding out ways where you can leverage where can they learn to make finer and finer distinctions. But normally the problem is that they don't have enough exposures to this particular thing with enough diversity in a compressed period of time. And those are the 3 elements that are necessary. So that's what came out of the perceptual learning research that I was using for my books, is that it's got to be enough diversity and variability within a short period of time. So there has to be enough exposures. And most of the time, people are not getting that in golfing. So something is missing. Either the diversity is missing, or the number of exposures of one particular aspect, right? Or it's not enough in one period of time. So if you do it once a week, for a normal golf game, or even 3 times a week, that's not enough. But if you actually focused for 1 or 2 days on just that, you would come over that hump. And there's just absolutely astonishingly fun studies on just that. But a lot of golfing is not about perceptual reading, right? It's about the skill in your own body. But there again, that's why differential learning works so powerfully, because your body is learning from all those different things it's doing. It's learning nothing from trying to repeat the same thing over and over again. So my co-authors and I, we always had this phrase that said, sameness is death. Because to the body, it's like, there is nothing to see here. There is nothing to do here. There's nothing to focus on here. There's nothing to adapt to. I already know how to do this, right? It has no incentive to get better unless it's trying to change something, metabolically, right? So I'm not going to get better skill. I'm just going to get better at being able to do this crappy skill more times. So it's like that our whole idea of what made people better was so broken, and it's so much more fun.
No, exactly. No,
without drills.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that sameness is death. And that's kind of like one that goes against like human nature because all we want to do is be at homeostasis and be the same and no change, no stress, all that stuff. But again, that's what makes it so fun. And that's something that like connecting to guitar, like one thing well, I started back in high school, then when it and I was learning every single like song I could from tablature and not reading music just because I didn't think it was like I didn't feel like it was necessary, didn't learn any music theory, and then went into college and I think I picked it back up last year, so I would say better part of maybe 8 to almost 10 years, I believe, and then picking it back up, and then I went right back to same stuff, tablature, all that stuff, and I was like, you know what? So I sound the same. I sound the same. I want to be different. I want to sound like myself, my own authentic self. So, one thing that I've just been doing was like uh, I've come to accept is all possibilities. Like the chromatic scale fits into everything and I play around with it. It might sound wrong, but that's an opportunity to learn and try something new,
That's
and
awesome.
be different. Yeah, and like I've been able, and one thing I'm a big like classic rock virtuoso, like, and I love classical music too as well. So like trying to do that on the guitar. But what I've actually done now is instead of being more and gravitating towards jazz music because I believe jazz music breaks the norms of
Oh
music
God.
theory a lot of times. I make the guitar sound like a saxophone. Like try to hear it. I'm not trying to go back to my old way of like let's find the tabs or the notes or the sheet music of this particular little
Wow.
phrase that this saxophone did it. I was like, I'm hearing this. It may take me 30 to 45, maybe 2 hours to learn this little thing, but
That's
I'm
awesome.
exploring in literally these amounts of frets, not the whole thing or anything like that. And
That's
within me picking up
amazing.
one year of trying this out, rewrote everything what I learned the 5, 6 years that I learned before I dropped it, and it's much more enjoyable now. That's and now I'm taking that to teaching my 14-month-old daughter and allowing her to have her own authenticity. And I'm not, and I've seen other kids where their parents are like, oh, they're not meeting their milestones, they're not meeting this, and I'm like, why? Like, that's putting more stress not on you, but putting it on them. And that's teaching them they have to meet a standard psychologically, all that stuff. And that could be just some past trauma that I've been through. But I'm like, I'm allowing her to do her own thing. As long as she's safe, free reign. Like, I want you to
Exactly.
learn and be authentic. And so
Our
a lot
our
of
our
these,
goal is to
eh,
create exposures to things. And
yes,
that's why we
yes,
call ourselves context designers. Like that's our job.
yes,
We're not standing back and saying do whatever. We're deliberately creating
yeah,
contexts where more
mm-hmm,
exposures, more safe exploration, but safety to take risks and safety to do the things,
mm-hmm,
that's why I always post videos of like very, very, very young animals deliberately choosing to play by doing very risky movements. Like where
mm-hmm,
landing safely is not guaranteed. Like there's obviously
yes,
something inside of us that wants to do that. I mean
mm-hmm,
that idea of yeah, we want sameness for safety, but that's why like but sameness is death. So if someone is current, like, or if a horse, like, that's why we always say the work we do, if a horse is currently traumatized, like you just took it out of a kill pin, right? And the horse is like terrified for its life, then it wants safety, right? But the sooner we move past
yes,
that is how they develop the confidence and self-efficacy that they can survive, they can cope. And so the sameness is death thing because if the body and or the our cognitive processes are not stimulated with that variability, then there's no reason to make any changes, right? First of all. But now it's sketchy, but there's at least some study from the game development world that shows that making something too easy is its own form of creating stress, like bored out instead of burnout, right? So there's a sweet spot. Now we know there's a sweet spot of challenge, for like flow state, for learning, but we always kind of thought of it as, okay, yeah, there's a U-shaped curve, right? And when the challenge is way up here, this is where good stuff can happen. If it goes too far, it's, too much. But we used to think, okay, but there's nothing wrong with things being easy. They're fun, or they're not even fun. They're just happy, right? Content, comfortable. There's no problem. They just don't provoke anything. But now there's at least some evidence that when things are too easy, and like with games in particular, and the person doesn't have any ability to raise the difficulty level, they actually start showing physiological stress markers. The same that people who are doing a game that's been artificially designed to be suddenly impossible to do, and you can't slow it down, right? That kind of thing. So it's like, I think it's really worth considering that those, the drills, the repetition, even if they feel comfortable and safe to someone, those are still creating their own form of stress just by having to do them. And, we use names like grinding, right? Like you just got to grind out, the repetitions and the drills or with music, and then you get to the good stuff later. So like people in the horse world they would train their horses robotically for years, and the horses would end up having the perfect, correct movements. And then they'd go, but now there's no expression. Like there's no expressiveness, and they're not going to get the good scores, if there's no sparkle and expression. And it's like, you have trained every ounce of expression out of them, and now you expect to sprinkle it on top. Like, okay, now that you robotically know exactly how to do everything, now go crazy and have fun. It's like, it's way too late. It's like, why wouldn't you have it baked in from the beginning, this authenticity? Yeah. And then, we also use this phrase, sneak the stuff they need under the radar. Like, there's no question there's stuff they need. And especially when you're looking at physical sports, right? And they need certain elements of strength. They need certain kinds of mobility that they might not ordinarily have reasons to do in the everyday. So there's certain things that we want, and certain things are going to require more repetition for tissue adaptation, right? We still have to hit enough repetitions without repetitions to cause tissue adaptations for the things that just are going to be physically hard. But we just call it sneaking it under the radar. Like, how can we give them challenges and activities and set up the games so that becomes a natural side effect? Like, there's problems to solve, and part of those problems, the only way to solve it is to do the hard thing that we secretly want them to do, but they don't even think about it. It's just happening, because how else would they solve it? How else would I get down this hill? How else would I keep track of this and while doing that, right? So we try to give them problems to solve, keeping enough variability, right? So we're not getting repetitive stress, but it's under the radar of motivation, right? Which can also mean things that can be really physically hard. So we don't want their prefrontal cortex or any part of their body to just go, don't do any more of this, or this is too hard, or why would I waste metabolic resources? I'm tired, right? Why don't you save your energy for something more useful? Why are you burning all this energy to do this thing? And I don't even understand why, right? So we kind of all know, right? There's lots of ways where for some people running on a track like feels exhausting, or a treadmill is even worse. But if they go out trail running, the same, actually more work, right? But there's a lot of variability. It can feel very different. So we try to find things that are under the radar. Or like when I was running, I had developed this but as an adult, not when I was running track, I had developed a very stuck posture. I mean, years of programming, right? Like this. And then I would run like this too. And I had this physical therapist, and I said, I don't know, how am I ever going to fix this? This is who I am now. And it's not going to do me any good to go shoulders back, right? Shoulders back, right? To tell myself over and
Hmm.
over, I could do that. I could make it top of mind. And I did try that, right? But instead of saying an internal focus, try to, fix my posture, uh, he would take me out trail running, and he would make me keep naming things that were 180 degrees to the side. He would just call it out. So if we're running like this, and he'd go, "What's that over there, right by that red tree?" And I'd have to go like this. It's really hard to do that without
Yeah.
coming up. So he gave me
Hmm.
like, you have to open up to actually have that view. But I never had it as a goal, look at what's going on, which is inherently interesting. It made the runs more fun, but it was like he didn't correct my
Yeah.
posture. He gave me a task that also made running more fun. And even though this was physically harder because I wasn't yet adapted tissue-wise to doing that, and it was amazing how years of me trying to fix my posture and then just starting to develop this constant, the habit was not top of mind, shoulders back, top of mind, open up, top of mind, do this, do that, right? It was top of mind, look at what's over there, look at what's over there. And it was like, and my body took care of what it had to do. So we think in
Hmm.
terms of like, can you train through side effects? Like, the thing that you want, what can you give them to do that will be interesting, that they will want to do, for which the thing you secretly want them to do is just an automatic, authentic side effect. It just falls out of that.
Hmm.
That's how I like to
That's
think about
it's
it.
kind yeah, it's kind of like it's kind of gamifying it for
Oh,
sure.
very much so.
Like when yeah, for sure. And that's one thing that like I wish I learned this like right away when diving into this whole umbrella of just thinking and this just whole mindset shift. It's like I'm very big into video games and games like Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot. I play that actually pretty effectively, or actively, I should say. Um, and looking at it, video games and artificial intelligence as well, like I kind of want to dive into that as well because that's kind of a hot topic. But video games, why I enjoy it so much is one, it's fun. I can drown myself in it for hours on end. Doesn't matter if it's healthy or not. But there's so many different problems and different ways I can scale it from difficulty. If I go from the easy difficulty, my bandwidth is so high because I could try whatever. But then when I want to go to a higher difficulty, I have this, my body and all that has tried those different points. And if I come up to some difficult opponent or challenge, I can try a little different things until I'm successful. That's where that, and when I came, this was me beating my head against the wall. And I was like, and just recently, actually a couple months, that kind of was just like, oh, okay. Now looking at Dungeons and Dragons context, it's like the whole, my imagination is open and what problems can I give my players to solve? And it's not one particular
That's
way.
awesome.
It's like you come up, it's like me saying, okay, like here's one way you can solve this problem, but it's up to you. And anything under the whole sun and moon is how can you solve that problem? Or like what environment you're in. And linking that up, that was huge. And my brother-in-law, he's kind of the one that got me into it. I told him, it's like, hey, mess around with the environment. He's like, what? That is so weird. I was like, it opens up different
That's so
problems.
cool.
That open up different problems for us to like adapt to. And he's just like, that's a lot. And I was like, I'll show you. Let's try it.
Yes. And one
Yeah,
of the
so
things that's
yeah,
made
that,
things fun, like for my husband's golf students, when he has a group instead of just one on one, he and this is true for both. He was the high school coach last year. This year he's not, but he mostly has adults, and a lot of his adults are older. Um, but he will like give them some crazy problem to solve, right? And then he will ask them to come up with their ideas of problems for other people to solve. And he didn't want to try that, and then he finally started trying it, and he was amazed at how quickly they, of course, enjoyed it, making very devilish problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also caused them to think more deeply about, okay, I want you to go through that tree. And, they started paying much more attention to the actual structure of the environment just by the fun of trying to solve problems instead of, I'm the coach, I'm going to set the problems for you to solve. Like having
Yeah.
them, I mean, he would create the constraints over what kinds of activities they were going to be working with, but they would decide, where does this person have to go? And then they would make problems where they would have to be one of the people who would have to solve it as well. But he said they come up with so many creative things, and at first they can't think of anything, and then suddenly there's this explosion. Because he's like, what if I can't think of anything? What if I can't come up with more than one or two things? And it's like, why don't you ask them? And then suddenly
Yeah.
you have 10 things, and then you document those,
Yep.
and those are part of your, for your next students, right? But
Yep.
when we think about, like in the research on game design, this whole idea and flow states and all of that, right? The brain is very drawn to focusing on novelty. So, and novelty can be tiny deviations from what was there before. So there can be an expectation, and then something is a little bit different. And you get these, like we would call them micro wake-ups. Like that even in our programming books, one of the things is that every single page looks different. You're not looking at a flow of text. Like, the design group for the publisher was like, you got to be kidding me. This is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Why are you changing fonts on every page? And it's like, well, it's intentional, right? But so we would do things where everything's a little different on every single page to just try to not have the brain be going, like when you're reading a textbook and you're like, you're interested, you're trying, your brain just can't stay focused. So we're doing tiny little micro wake-ups with every tiny thing that's a little different. And that can be everything, including what is the coach wearing? What's the angle of the coach's hat, right? Like every little thing in the environment can be just a little different. Sometimes a little off, right? Sometimes a little like, huh? But those things start to create good chemistry. And that chemistry is the chemistry that's really good for learning. So it doesn't even
Mm-hmm.
matter, what it is. So like long ago, in the early days of AI, and they were studying how to make artificial intelligence tutors. I mean, this is, decades before we would even conceive of something like a ChatGPT. This is when they thought they could code it all, or I should say me, I was in that group too. But so there were these wonderful studies on education and learning. And one of them was a deep analysis of really good teachers in a classroom. And they would have all their grad students, be doing transcripts, right, of every single moment of these classrooms of experiences, everything the teacher said, everything that happened, right? And then they would go through and they would remove all the things that they thought were noise, and noise was considered not good, right? So like the teacher dropped his pencil, right? Something that had nothing to do with the content of the instructional, thing. And then after a while, they started realizing that when they did more analysis, actually that's not noise. Those things matter. I mean, now there have been studies that have shown when something like that happens, right? Or like we used to tell our teachers, at some point when the students are going, teaching programming, right? Pretend to stub your toe on the table, right? And I guarantee everything that you taught right before that and right after that will be better remembered. And it's that idea of even the things that are seemingly random that don't have anything to do with the actual nature of the learning, but they stimulate the brain and the body. And so they're helping put the brain and the body into a better environment for learning, right? So those we're just trying to mess with tiny chemical changes, and that kind of novelty It can be really small, or of course it can be really big. I mean, we also do really big, giant novelty things with our horses. Or like you can imagine a really extreme differential learning, right? Okay, now golf, standing on one leg with one hand on your head, hit the ball, right? The really crazy stuff. But you would only do that once, and then you would do a different crazy thing. But every single
Mhm.
weird, crazy moment is still, you've gathered a new dot, a dot that you never would have
Mhm.
collected by training, incrementally improving repetition on the correct thing. And one of the things they're finding out in some of these robotics research is that the robot actually did some crazy thing way out here that no one expected to be useful. It was just included for the data. But they can trace back and see it used something it learned by doing this crazy thing to get better at the thing it's actually supposed to do. And it's like that's what we try to take out of human learning, which we shouldn't. And now the roboticists are saying we got to put that stuff in. We can't train robots like
Yeah.
machines. We need to train them like
Yeah. No,
animals.
it's
And they don't say humans because I think they know we train humans badly. They'll go, we need to look at animals. How do animals learn to move? How do animals learn to adapt in the wild? They can do these incredible things, and they were never taught to do them.
hmm exactly. And that's huge. And I think that's speaking of AI, like I've actually one thing that really popped in my head, I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine. He says he's like anti-AI, all of that, just because he thinks that it's going to replace us and, the whole thing that people are saying, like, oh yeah, like the new Terminator is going to come sometime and it's new age. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't believe because, well, there's so many complexities within this organic system of everything and how animals like survive. But also, I believe that AI can help enhance our potential if used with context um, within that, I believe. If you can use it as a tool versus a replacement, which I think I saw on social media like last week, there was like a MIT study that showed like the brain scan of with ChatGPT versus not with ChatGPT, and it lit up like without ChatGPT, it lit up versus with, and I was like, was it looking at the context? It was everything that they were doing from the very beginning of like it. AI was doing everything for the human, so that's what shut everything off. Versus if they used it to be authentic and enhance their potential. And that's where I was just like, and people, and that kind of, and how the media is like, they're going to show what they're going to show and all that stuff. But I'm like, I dove a little deeper and I'm thinking, this study's only showing if they're using it 24/7 versus using it incrementally to help them improve their skills. I want to get your take on that.
I I mean, I think we're at such a early stage, a tiny baby stage of where these things have just suddenly jumped to a whole new level of emergence. And that's,
Mhm.
I think my feeling, and I know a lot of the people who are really, I mean, having worked in Silicon Valley, who are kind of high placed in those different realms of AI at these different companies, and I look at what they say, and they're, I would say almost everyone who really understands the stuff. I don't. I only understand it a little, but I understand it more than probably most sort of a person who doesn't come from that world. But I still only understand it a little bit.
Mhm.
Is that nobody really knows? I mean, it the because they are using complexity. Like in the old days, the reason AI didn't work in the sort of early generation that I was a part of is because we were trying to code everything. We were trying to write instructions. And again, that's where the first research on let's extract expertise, let's extract knowledge from experts and build systems. They were called expert systems that could, do what the expert would do. And one of my first projects in school was to create software that could diagnose and give instructions to repair a toaster. And I'm not talking about a new computerized smart toaster. I mean a freaking old school, the toaster you would find, now at this, antique shop. And I, of course, the professors knew what they were doing. They would give us all these projects that they knew we would go, oh, this will be a piece of cake, right? And that we would find out very quickly that even something as seemingly simple as repairing a very simple mechanical toaster started to explode in the rules when you were trying to write it with Boolean logic, right? If this and this or this, then do this. Oh, but not if there's this. And then if there's that. And pretty soon the complexity was so high, you couldn't construct code for it. So you could do some very basic things. But that's when we kind of realized that whole path of artificial intelligence was not going to work. And then they sort of went into what's now called the AI winter, right? Where people just said, and then they started working on artificial neural networks, like a whole new model of saying, let's just have a bunch of stuff that it's not really meant to emulate what we think actual neurons are doing, but it's the idea where if we have enough and we let them just do their thing, it will suddenly come up with things, but we didn't have the compute power for it. So for decades, there was not much happening. And then all of a sudden, these game GPUs came out, and to make good graphics for gaming machines, suddenly there was an explosion of basically cheap computing. So these AI researchers were like, oh, we're back in business, baby. We can buy all of these things and we can just throw the problem at these layers. And so most artificial intelligence today, the programmers don't know what it's doing. It doesn't reveal how it's actually doing what it does. Now, in the early days, right, we thought, well, we'll just train like imagine, this is when you realize the complexity and the folly of trying to do correct biomechanical technique, et cetera, et cetera. Take a bunch of Google's best engineers and you put them in a room and you say, let's teach a computer how to recognize dogs from cats in photos on the internet. Okay, guys, write down all the rules that you're going to code in. How do you determine something is a dog versus a cat? What are the rules? I mean, a 6-year-old can do it pretty damn well. And they start writing down the rules, and then for every rule, they start finding out there's exceptions. Like, some people would go, well, what about this dog? What about that cat? Right? It's like, but then how, what is essential dogness and catness? That became almost impossible. Of course, how do people ride a bike? That becomes impossible, right? So things that seemed simple. So there's something known as Moravec's paradox in computing and artificial intelligence. It means that things that are hard for humans to do, like huge calculations really fast, are super easy for computers to do, for AI. And things that are just a 3-year-old can do are really hard for computers, which is also why, of course, robotics has really been hard. But they said, well, okay, here's how we're going to do it then. We're just going to take these computers and we're just going to give them labeled data. Huge, thank God internet, right? There's 1 million cat pictures and 1 million dog pictures, and we'll label them. And then the computer programs will just process this huge amount of data and say, okay, that's a cat. Okay, that's a dog. Okay, that's a cat. Okay, that's a dog. And then you give them tests to see. So that was supervised learning, right? Then they started to do, this is more of the newer versions, but it's been a while, unsupervised data. They said, we're just going to throw it at so many different things, and we're not going to tell it what's a cat or what's a dog. Now, this is when every human being should go, how the hell can anyone learn without being told? How could it possibly learn, right? What does that actually mean? Then they realized what the things were learning, because they were learning, is they were learning how to perceive. They were learning what matters in perception of an image. And they could inspect some of that. They could go, oh, it's looking at, we don't know why, but it's looking at something in the edge that somehow represents catness versus dogness. And we're not even able to know what it is, but we're going to go with it. And that was, 15, almost 20 years ago. Where we are now, no one understands how these things work. I mean, they know the algorithms are actually really simple, but they're not being told how to do the things they do. They're just figuring shit out and going, oh, sorry for my language. And then, here's the result.
It's all good.
So I think on one hand, I'm super excited about it because if you like complexity, like obviously we do, and emergence, well, that's why these things are suddenly doing amazing things, because they're now allowing them. They've just set up an environment where these things can figure stuff out and learn for themselves with very high exposures. And they can do it at rates that humans couldn't, right? They can do it really fast. They can have, thousands of experiences in a really short period of time. But we don't know. Programmers don't know how the thing is doing what it's doing. They at a very high level they do, but it's a complexity that is both really exciting to me because it's accepting, this is beyond our capability of understanding what's going on, but that's also terrifying. So I don't have a very high doom rating of what's going to happen, but I just think that we can't actually know. So for me, what matters is that we start really looking at the people behind these companies and who they are and what kind of, ethical constraints they're under. And right now, the explosion has been because there's basically an arms race. So if you're trying to compete, anything that you might do to put the brakes on or to make sure that things are going to be safe, or even if they don't know exactly how they're going to do that. So for me, it matters who's behind it. And I think there's some really smart, caring people, but many of the founders of a lot of what's used in modern AI have left the field because it scares them. So we should pay attention to that. The people who know more than we do are not happy with what's happening, but some of them are still there, and they're saying, well, if all the ethical people leave, then what's left, right? So the ethical people should fight the good fight inside for what's happening, and but I do think that using it as we also don't barely know how to use it. So I think what you said was really important, because we're going to learn how to use it as a tool instead of just do a thing for me, and then it might as well just be a calculator, right? And that I think is only going to get better and better. So I do think in that sense, it's just gonna, when we learn how to use the tools this way, we're just going to be able to do anything we want to do, but better with more interesting input. It's going to be like having a whole bunch of really, really smart friends and mentors, and that might sometimes say crazy things that don't make any sense. But I think right now, I think it's going to be upside, but the chance of Terminator, it's non-zero.
No, I mean, it's like 0.0000001% chance. It can happen. Who knows? Like the future is all it is.
But I think as a movement,
movement
professional, now they're finally, excuse me, now they're finally getting to much more into robotics, because robotics turned out to be really awful, right? You've seen all the robotic fails. It's like, wait, again, smartest people on the planet. And the ones that give really impressive demos are usually because it's completely pre-scripted and choreographed, right? Those robots couldn't go out and just do stuff. They can execute performances. But they've started to make some progress, and that progress is what excites me because of how they're doing it, because they're saying we need to learn from animals. So they're studying animal adaptation, and it's like, movement professionals should have been doing this work, right? But the roboticists are
Hmm.
saying you can't train robots like robots. And here we are training humans and horses like robots,
Hmm.
right? Thinking they're machines. They're like,
Yep.
no, we need to train machines the way animals adapt. And so I think that's helping
Yep.
to push, even though it maybe isn't widespread yet, I think this is going to help really push our profession forward in a big way. Because what's coming out
Hmm.
is all in support of complexity and dynamical systems and emergence and exploration and differential learning, right? It's just like that's how they're getting results that are really impressive. So I love that. I'm like, that's another big,
Yeah.
big indicator that's helping move us to this new paradigm.
No, I love it. I love it. This whole conversation, for me, I don't have words to explain it. It was very, my brain is rattling inside my head right now and just like I'm giddy and whatnot. One thing that I love about, you know, running a podcast now and having conversations, and I'm trying to embody this mindset as best as I can, which is all we can do, is like learn as is. And like what I think Bruce Lee, I could be wrong, is like embrace what is. Um, is there any question during this whole conversation that I should have asked that I didn't?
I not that I can think of. No,
Okay,
I think
that's good.
somehow
And,
we touched on the things that I think are um I mean the only thing, and this is not a discussion, maybe someday we'll have a different other separate discussion about this,
yeah,
but I do think that there's a discussion to be had again, not now because I love everything that we've already talked about. It does get
yes,
difficult when people uh I mean, I'm going to choose to see this as a good sign, but there's a lot of pushback against this, right? And in the days of social media, that can often mean like not just criticism, but hate, and real attacks
hmm,
against, anything ecological dynamics, differential learning, nonlinear pedagogy, all of it, anything that's really not the traditional path. And that, like Alex Sarama, right? Transforming basketball. I know he's been taking
hmm,
huge hits. I mean, Sean, when we had that conversation almost 10 years ago, he'd been taking hits, and I know that's continued. So even though things have made a lot more progress and there's more people, a lot more awareness, there's like sport specific podcasts with an eco defocus for almost every sport I can think of now. I mean, things are really happening in a great way. But I think because of that, the pushback, right? People feeling for all the reasons that I know you mentioned earlier, right? I mean, for some people, it could just be straight up. This is how they make their money doing these drills that are based on a flawed assumption, what we now consider not supported
hmm,
by science. Um, and
yep,
then just ego. If this is how you made your name because you're good at this thing, and I know that feeling. I've been in my past really good at something that turned out to be a thing. I'm like, damn it, why does the science say that that's not the thing I should be good at? Because yeah, I'm really good at the wrong thing. Um, there's pushback for that, right? Some people it's just like scary. I mean, this can feel scary, and I don't make it seem less scary. Like I embrace it because I think of it as this incredible freedom and fun, right? Things that you've clearly looked at and found for yourself, right? This is so much more exciting and fun, and I don't feel the fear anymore. And I don't. It's been so long, I don't remember when I did, but I know, But I'll say things like, "Oh yeah, this is a total jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. It's awesome." And people are like, "You have a 1,200-pound animal. that's, that could kill me. And here you are going, let's just have a good time. And, which I absolutely mean, right? But this whole sense of, or people feel they're going to maybe lose their livelihood, or people have absolutely lost friendships over making this transition, right? Their peers, their communities that they were a part of, and now they're moving further away because it's harder for them to feel comfortable in that space talking about those drills, right? When you want to say, dude, have you seen all the research? But that pushback is making it really hard right now. Certainly in the equestrian world, it's really hard. It's very harsh, very harsh. But at the same time, I feel like that's an indicator that we're making progress. Like it's becoming more widespread, these concepts in all different ways. And that a lot of people are having some cognitive dissonance, and it's going to be a struggle. And it is much more comforting to feel like you have a path and here are your steps, or like the book that you mentioned, right? Here's how you're going to train for the year. Here's your periodization right down to the day, right? Everything you're going to do. And that having that step-by-step recipe, that was very comforting. Or biomechanics, it's just physics, right? It's just moment arms and levers, and we got some force plates, and, we know exactly, and we can optimize for the one right thing. And then all you have to do is just find a way to get there, right? And different teachers would base their program on how good they were at cueing, or what they used to get you into the one correct way, and how often you could repeat it, right? And all of these things that people got good at, and now we're saying no, but we're not saying do nothing. And I think there's a lot of straw men, right? Like, oh, you Eco-D guys, you just stand there and let people flail around until they magically figure it out, right? So obviously we're pushing back on that. Or now we have a new problem. But I still think, okay, this is a sign of progress, is people will go pretend to have embraced it. Oh yeah, I do constraints. And then, like Rob Gray says, if you use constraints so that in the end there's still only one way they can actually do it, then you've missed the point of constraints, right? But normally we should think of constraints as a way to say do something other than the thing you've been doing, not do this one thing, right? And so some people will go, oh yeah, I do it too, but they're not. But then they can sort of pretend to have embraced it. But for me, it's like, if you're still giving shaping instructions by any means, with the horses, it's usually with equipment. With humans, it's like, okay, you still got to get your shoulder back, and you still got to get that right foot going over here. And, then no, you never get to the good stuff. And I think if people try to dabble a little bit, this I see as a problem. They try to dabble a little bit. Now they're just in a mess because they're not on the other side of helping people really discover for themselves. No good things are emerging. They just have people flailing, literally going, but tell me what to do. And now you're not telling me what to do, and I don't know what to do. So if they just shut up, but they don't yet know how to design for constraints and affordances, right? I feel like it's better for people, like I will say, if you're in your competition season, that's not the time to start doing this. Wait till your season's over. Just exploit what you got, right? And now after your season is over, now let's go, right? They're going to be a lot more open to exploring, and, because things, nobody wants to suck again. Like they suck, and now they're somehow much better. Nobody wants to fall back to the suck threshold. And, to embrace this, you have to be willing to be all over the place. And sometimes you're going to suck, and that sucking is your path to, making a nonlinear leap. So it's like, that's during competition is not the time to do that. But find the season when you're really willing to say, I'm going to explore now. And, again, like the 2 weeks versus 20 years, right? So that is, I think, looking at how to help people feel good during the transition. Because I think this is, we know this is where it's going. We know the science is heavily in our favor for this, but it's it's only just now that more tools for how to actually do it are happening. And so helping
Hmm.
people feel more comfortable making the transition, I think that's where we need to be going. And I think that's where people like the Emergence guys and, your podcast, right?
Hmm.
People are trying to do that now. And I think all of that is going to be really helpful for people to just feel confident that it's going to be, yes, it's going to be very uncertain and you're not going to know what to do. And guess what? That's okay. And guess what? There are people here to to
Hmm.
support you and you're not alone. And it's fun.
Yeah. No. Yeah, no, that's something like I've broken out of my shell of like that, and why again, leading back to the unfinished podcast, like it's okay to be messy.
I
It
love
doesn't
it.
have to be pristine. It doesn't have to be like a Lego brick. I want it to look as messy as possible because if you haven't tried multiple ways, like you might not be able to get to the Mona Lisa, be able to paint that because I
Yeah.
guarantee that the Mona Lisa wasn't painted it like very strategically. It happened through trial and error and mess. And so
And
that's
mess.
why like with
And
this like
probably a lot
yes,
of
a mess.
happy
But
accidents.
yes, exactly. That's like one thing too. Even before actually before like we hopped on here, I went through used AI and my keen sense of just like learning your background and be like, okay, my brain was like, I kind of want to go back to like I want a structured outline, I want to structure this, all that. And I said, okay, no, give me a couple questions to kind of be in the unknown and be in the mess, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think actually, to be completely transparent, I was like, I want this to rival Joe Rogan. But even when I listen to Joe Rogan, his isn't his is messy. His podcast is messy too, and there's a reason why he's number one on Spotify. He's the one he's like he has the name to it, but his podcast, his episodes are messy. And I was like, okay, we're just going to dive into it. These podcasts are going to be
Exactly.
unfinished, messy. Conversations are that way in general, and I think that people got to embrace that more. So
Yes. You
yeah.
got to be willing to take the scenic routes even when it might take you
Hmm.
backwards from where you thought you
Yeah.
wanted to go. That is part of the essence of nonlinearity. Is that it's not
Hmm.
as
For sure.
and that's I think that's how I sum up a lot of the problems that we've always had and the differences is that linear pedagogy assumes we're on a ladder and we're just step by step, you just keep climbing and you know the goal, it's up there and you're just going to keep incrementally getting there, and in reality we're actually in a maze and we don't know we're in a maze.
Hmm.
So on a maze, right, if you just keep going forward you're going to hit a wall. And then the one thing you
Yep.
don't want to do is if you think you're on a ladder, the last thing you want to do is go backwards. But for a maze, you got to go backwards, you got to go sideways, you got to go all the
Yep.
places you don't think you should go. And if we use that as the metaphor for where we're trying to go, it's all that exploration that eventually gets us out. But if we're still
Hmm.
focused on thinking we're on a ladder, we will never get out. So I love those ideas of you have to be willing to go, and some of those are going to be dead ends, and that's okay too.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I
So
think
thank
what
you. This is very, very delightful for
yeah,
me
yeah.
because I obviously love to
No,
have this
I'm glad.
conversation, and I don't get to have it very often. So
Um,
thank you.
well, I know hopefully this this I'm sure we're going to have future conversations and whatnot. So I want to thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank
It's blown my
you.
mind many times over, and I'm very grateful for you, Kathy.
Thank you so much. And by the way, while I'm here, I just want to say I absolutely love the things that you've been posting on Instagram. It's just amazing
Thank
and
you. Thank
fresh
you.
and useful, and because I only just discovered you on Instagram, so I'm so grateful that you reached out because now I've been like
Hmm.
binging. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very humbling to hear, and I'm grateful for that.
So thank you.